Good morning. I'm here to continue the story, It Was Dusk. Yesterday, I'll read the last paragraph from yesterday. By the time Oliver was finished with what he had to say, he was pacing the floor like an actor delivering an emotional soliloquy on a stage. Then he looked at his aunt and saw she was crying. He rushed over to her and said, "My God, Aunt Mattie, what's wrong?" Aunt Mattie waved him away and blew her nose several times. "Never could have been a Miss America, you know. Always have to blow my nose when I cry. They don't allow 'em hankies. No room to stuff one in them skimpy dresses, neither." Oliver said, "Did I hurt your feelings?" Aunt Mattie looked at her nephew through watery eyes and said this: "Ollie, I'm going to tell you something I never told no one in the family, though there's plenty here in town that likely knows. I'd prefer it if you wouldn't mention it after this, though." Oliver nodded and gave the Boy Scout three-fingered sign. "Oh, don't give me that Scout's honor donkey poop," exclaimed Aunt Mattie. "Just promise that you won't tell your mother." "I promise." "All right, then." Aunt Mattie closed her eyes and spoke without opening them. "Years ago, I used to date Pop Kirshner. Of course, before he married Gertie. We were just in high school then, 10th grade it was, and we had a fight. We had been a couple since about 5th grade, but this fight broke us up. I was mad, and I went out with Engelbert's best friend." Oliver thought, so that's why they call him Pop. "Well, Tommy took me to the only drive-in they had around here back then. It was over the county line. My parents wouldn't have let me go, but I snuck out. See, he was 16 and I was 15. He drove me in his daddy's truck. And don't you know that truck had 2 blowouts on the way to the movie? We never even got to see it. Of course, he took all the farm roads. So when we had them blowouts, Tommy had me stay with the truck, and he walked several miles to a farmhouse. The people who lived there sent their hands with a tractor and pulled the truck to their house. By then it was about 11 at night. They didn't have a phone. Most folks didn't back then, especially with the war going on and all. Or a whole bunch were all on one big party line. Anyhow, these folks didn't have a phone. And new tires were scarce, too. That's why these busted in the first place. They were all patches on top of patches. The war and shortage of rubber, you know. So anyways, the people put me in bed with the wife, and Tommy and the husband slept on the floor in the front room. You can imagine, by the next morning, my parents were frantic. They had the sheriff out looking for me. Well, Tommy had bragged to Bert that he was going to date me since Bert had let me go. So Bert told my parents I was probably with Tommy. To make a long story short, and a lot of crying short, the sheriff took the back roads towards the drive-in and saw Tommy's daddy's truck in the farmyard. It was still early in the morning. Turns out the people we stayed with didn't have such a good reputation. The husband was a suspected bootlegger. So naturally folks' minds get to thinking and imagining, once they heard where we'd spent the night, what must have gone on. Of course, nothing like they thought up went on at all. But this town hadn't changed much in some ways in 60 years. My reputation was shot. Engelbert was forbidden by his father to take me back. So he ran off and lied about his age and joined the army. That's where he met Gertie, in Germany. And when the war was over, home he came with a German bride, and actually a distant relative of the Kirschner she was. Oh, there was talk about her for a long time. You know, German, Nazi, and all that. But since she was a Kirschner, not only married to Burke, but a distant cousin to boot, the talk finally died down. Also, turns out she was originally Swedish and had moved to Germany with her parents shortly before the war. Her father was the Kirschner relative and her mother was the Swede.
Aunt Mattie sat silent and sniffed a few times. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Oliver. She spoke.
The wrongs done to Sarah ain't the first ones done on this road by far. But I reckon it's time to right some of 'em. Now that I can get around some, why don't you take me over to meet her?
Oliver was stunned. He said, "Let's drive. Then you can walk up the path to her cottage. Won't be so tiring for you that way."
Suit yourself,
said Aunt Mattie. Sarah was sitting on the front porch, rereading the letters from her children when Oliver's car drove up. She looked up and simply smiled when she saw Miss Harris in the car with him. She stood up as they walked down the pathway to the front steps.
"Young lady,"
said Aunt Mattie,
"Ollie's going to give me an introduction that's long overdue."
She looked at Oliver and said,
"Well, go ahead."
"Matilda Harris, may I introduce you to your neighbor, Sarah Smith?" Oliver began the introductions. Aunt Mattie smiled and shook Sarah's hand.
"Aunt Mattie to you, dear,"
she said to Sarah. Oliver's mouth hung open in shock, and his aunt said,
"Close your mouth, Ollie, before fly goes in."
Sarah invited them in and made some peppermint tea. As they sat, Aunt Mattie began to tell stories from her past as if she were among old friends. I'm going to stop here today, but if you've been interested in the story at all, you'll want to tune in tomorrow, because most of the stories that Aunt Mattie tells are real things that happened to real people. Have a good day.